Come closer, my friend, and let me set a single picture before you, softly, the way one sets a candle down upon an old wooden table. A young woman stands at a marble window high in a palace by the sea. Below her, a great harbor glimmers, and at its mouth a tower of white stone rises into the evening, crowned with fire, throwing its light out across the dark water for the ships coming home. She is watching those ships. She is watching a kingdom that is very old and very tired and very beautiful. And she is wondering quietly how to keep it from slipping beneath the waves of a changing world. The world would remember her as many things she was not. Tonight, we will simply remember her as she was, the last queen of Egypt, thinking by a window while the lighthouse burns. Ah, there you are. Come in, and close the door gently behind you against the night. I have been waiting for you here by the fire with the old books all asleep upon their shelves. Settle yourself now. Find that soft and yielding place where your body feels held, and let your shoulders come down away from your ears, and let your hands grow heavy and still. If the lamp beside you is bright, you may dim it or let your eyes close against it, whichever is easier. There is nothing you need to do here but rest. I am only going to tell you a story, an old and true one, the way I always do. And I want you to know before we begin that you cannot fall behind and you cannot miss anything. If sleep should come and carry you off in the middle of a sentence, then let it. The story will keep. The fire will keep. I will keep. Nothing here asks anything of you. So let the fire warm you, and listen to the quiet turning of a page, and let me tell you tonight about a queen who lived and ruled long ago at the very edge of the ancient world. Let us begin not with her, but with the city that made her, for she belonged to it as surely as the pearl belongs to the shell. The city was Alexandria, and it stood upon the northern shore of Egypt, where the great river meets the sea. It had been founded some 300 years before our queen was born by a young conqueror named Alexander, who had swept out of Greece and across the known world, and who had paused here on this quiet stretch of coast and drawn, with a handful of barley meal, the outline of the streets he wished to see. He never lived to watch it rise, but rise it did, into one of the wonders of the age. Picture it with me gently. Long straight avenues, wider than any you have walked, laid out in a careful grid and cooled by the breeze off the water. White buildings, pale as bone in the sun, and two great marvels above all the rest. The first was the lighthouse, the Pharaohs, that tower of stone we glimpsed a moment ago, so tall that sailors saw its flame long before they saw the land. One of the 7 wonders of the old world. And the second, dearer to me than any tower, was the library. Oh, the library of Alexandria. You and I have sat by this fire before and mourned it together, and we shall not dwell there tonight, only to say that in Cleopatra's time it still stood, still gathered the scrolls of every land, still hummed with scholars bent over their work in the lamplight. She grew up in a city that believed knowledge was worth more than gold. Remember that about her as we go. It matters. Now, here is a thing that surprises many people, so let me tell it softly. Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt, the last of the pharaohs in a line that stretched back thousands of years. And yet she was not, by blood, Egyptian at all. She was Greek. Her family were called the Ptolemies. They descended from one of Alexander's generals, a Macedonian soldier named Ptolemy, who, when the great conqueror died and his empire was carved up among his commanders, was given Egypt to rule. And so this Greek family settled into the ancient land, took up the crown of the pharaohs, married within itself to keep the bloodline close, and reigned for nearly 300 years, speaking Greek, keeping Greek customs, ruling a people whose own tongue most of them never troubled to learn. Most of them, but not our queen. Cleopatra was born around the year 69 before the Common Era into this long, proud, and troubled dynasty. And even as a child, she was, they say, unusually clever, not beautiful, beyond compare, whatever the old paintings would later pretend, but quick and curious, and gifted with languages the way some children are gifted with music. It was said she could speak with the peoples of many nations, each in their own tongue, so that ambassadors who came before her needed no one to translate. And she was, the stories tell us, the very first of all her Greek family, in 3 long centuries, to trouble herself to learn the language of the Egyptian people she ruled. Think on that gentle detail, and what it tells you of her mind. Here was a girl who looked at the country she was born to inherit, and wished, it seems, to truly understand it, its speech, its gods, its ancient ways, rather than merely to sit above it. She studied, she listened. In a family famous for its blindness and its cruelty to one another, she was, from the first, a watcher and a learner. But the throne she was born beneath was not a peaceful one, my friend. The Egypt of her childhood was a kingdom in slow decline, still wealthy, still dazzling, yet weaker each year. And beyond its borders, across the sea to the north, a new and hungry power was rising, one that watched Egypt's golden granaries with a keen and patient eye. That power was Rome, and the shadow of Rome would fall across her whole life. Her father, a king named Ptolemy XII, understood this shadow well. To keep his crown, he had learned to flatter the Romans, to borrow their money and buy their friendship. And it made him no friends among his own people. There were revolts, there was exile, and return. It was an uneasy, frightened court that little Cleopatra grew up within. A court of whispers and poisons and shifting loyalties, where a royal child learned very young to watch every face and trust very few. And so she grew, this clever girl by the sea, in the last bright evening of a very old kingdom. Let her stand there a while longer at her window in the palace by the harbor, with the lighthouse burning and the library breathing softly in the dark. For soon enough her father would die, and the crown would come down upon her head, and the true trials of her life would begin. When her father died, the crown of Egypt did not pass to Cleopatra alone. That was not the way of her family, and it would have been simpler for her, perhaps, if it had been. By the old custom of the Ptolemies, Egypt was to be ruled by a king and a queen together, side by side, and, in the strange and inward manner of that dynasty, the king and queen were very often brother and sister, married to one another to keep the sacred bloodline undivided. It is a thing that sits uneasily with us now, and I will not linger on it, only tell you plainly that this was the world she was born into, and these were its rules. So when the old king's will was read, it named 2 heirs to share the throne. One was Cleopatra, then about 18 years of age. The other was her younger brother, a boy of perhaps 10 called Ptolemy the 13th. Imagine it, a grown young woman of 18, thoughtful and educated and ready to rule, bound by law and by marriage to a child of 10, and expected to share the most powerful throne in the ancient world with him. It could not last in peace. It was never going to. At first, being so much the elder and the wiser, Cleopatra took the greater share of power into her own hands, and for a little while she ruled Egypt very much alone, putting her own name and her own face first upon the coins and the decrees, letting her small brother stand in her shadow. She was capable. The land in those first seasons was in careful hands. But a child king is never truly alone, my friend. Around her little brother, there gathered a circle of ambitious men, a scheming adviser, a commander of the army, a keeper of the household, clever and ruthless courtiers who saw in the boy a puppet they might hold, and in his grown sister an obstacle they wished to be rid of. They whispered to the boy. They flattered him and frightened him and turned him against her. And slowly, patiently, they built their power around his little throne until the balance in the palace began to tip. There were hard years pressing in from every side as well. The river Nile, upon which all of Egypt's life and grain depended, ran low in those seasons. Poor floods, thin harvests, hungry cities. When bread grows scarce, a people grows restless, and a court grows fearful, and every rival begins to sharpen his knives. The advisers of the boy king used all of it, and at last they moved against her openly. Cleopatra was forced from her own capital, driven out of Alexandria, out of the palace by the sea where she had grown up watching the ships, away from the library and the lighthouse and the throne that was hers by right. She fled to the eastern edges of the kingdom and beyond into the lands near Syria, an exiled queen without a crown. But here, listen closely, and you will begin to see the steel in her that the old caricatures forget. She did not weep in exile and fade away. She did not accept that her story was over. Out there, at the margins of her lost kingdom, this young woman, barely into her 20s, began quietly and methodically to raise an army of her own. She gathered soldiers. She gathered support. She meant to come back and to take her throne again, and she was prepared to fight her own brother's forces for it. And so the two halves of Egypt's royal house drew up against each other. On the one side, the boy king Ptolemy and his circle of grasping advisers holding the capital. On the other, the exiled queen with her gathering troops waiting at the border. Two children of the same father, each wearing half a crown, each unwilling to yield it, and a tired, hungry kingdom caught between them. It might have come to a long and bitter civil war, brother against sister, army against army, beneath the indifferent sun. But something happened just then that changed everything, that swept away the small quarrels of the Egyptian court and set them against a far greater tide. For into this divided kingdom, into this very quarrel between a sister and a brother, there came sailing all at once the most powerful man in the entire world. He came from Rome. He came with legions at his back and the dust of a great war still upon him. And when he dropped anchor in the harbor of Alexandria, beneath the burning lighthouse, the whole story of Cleopatra and of Egypt itself was about to turn upon its hinge. But that, my friend, is where we shall pause for tonight's first rest. The Roman is at the door. The queen is waiting beyond the border, and the fire has burned down just a little, and that is well. The man who sailed into the harbor of Alexandria was named Julius Caesar. You may know the name already, for the world has never quite let go of it. He was a Roman general, and by this time the most powerful man in Rome, which is to say, the most powerful man alive. He had just won a great and terrible war against a rival, a war that had split Rome in two and drawn its armies across the whole of the known world. His defeated rival had fled to Egypt, hoping to find shelter there, and had been murdered upon the shore by the advisors of the boy King Ptolemy, who thought foolishly that killing Caesar's enemy would win them Caesar's favor. It did not. When they brought the severed head of his old rival to him, Caesar, they say, wept and turned away and was not pleased at all. And so he settled himself into the royal palace of Alexandria, the very palace of Cleopatra's childhood. And there he sat, this Roman, with his soldiers about him, in the heart of Egypt's power, declaring that he would judge for himself the quarrel between the exiled queen and her little brother. Now Cleopatra was still beyond the border with her army locked out of her own capital, and she understood with that quick and watching mind of hers that everything now turned upon this Roman. Whoever won Caesar's favor would win Egypt. Her brother's men held the palace and the city. They could speak to Caesar whenever they wished and poison his ear against her. She could not simply march in. The harbor was watched. The gates were held against her. If she were to reach Caesar at all, she would have to do it by cunning and by daring and alone. And here we come to one of the most famous moments of her whole life. And I will tell it to you gently, for beneath its boldness, it is really a story about courage. She had herself smuggled into the palace. The old tale says she was wrapped up and carried in past the guards. Some say in a rolled-up bed sack or a length of bedding, bundled over the shoulder of a single loyal servant, a man named Apollodorus, who bore her through the gates as though carrying nothing but linens. And so, past all her brother's soldiers, past every man who wished her dead, the queen of Egypt was carried secretly into her own palace and set down and unwrapped and rose up before the astonished Roman, alone, unarmed, and entirely herself. Imagine his surprise and hers. Picture the courage it took to place your whole life, your whole kingdom, into a bundle carried past armed men, and to trust that when you stood up, you would find the words to save yourself. She found them. Whatever passed between them that night, and the old writers love to imagine it, we may say plainly that Caesar was captivated, not merely by her person, but by her mind, her wit, her learning, her many languages, the sheer quick brilliance of her. Here was a woman who could speak with him as an equal, of philosophy and kingship and the running of a great state. He had met no one quite like her. By the morning the world had shifted. Caesar took her side. Her brother's men did not accept it quietly. There followed a short, sharp, dangerous war within the very city. Caesar and Cleopatra together, besieged inside the palace quarter, with the boy king's army pressing all around them. There was fighting in the streets and along the harbor. It was in the chaos of these days, some believe, that a fire spread near the docks, and did harm to part of the great library's collection. Though the truth of that, like so much of that night, is smudged and uncertain, and I will not press a sorrow upon you that the records themselves cannot prove. In the end, Caesar's veteran legions prevailed. The boy King Ptolemy fled and drowned in the waters of the Nile, weighed down, they say, by his own golden armor. His grasping advisers were undone, and Cleopatra, the queen who had been carried into her own home in a bundle of cloth, was queen in full once more. Her throne restored, her rivals swept away, the most powerful man in the world at her side. They spent a season together, she and Caesar, in the ease that comes after a war is won. The old stories tell of a slow and splendid journey up the river Nile, the two of them aboard a great royal barge, drifting south past temples and green fields and the ancient stone giants of a civilization far older than Rome. Caesar, the conqueror, gazing up in wonder at monuments that had stood 1,000 years before his city was even a village. And in time, Cleopatra bore a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, a child in whom the blood of Egypt's pharaohs and the blood of Rome's greatest man were joined in one small body. But Caesar could not stay. Rome called him home, as Rome always did. He returned to the great city across the sea to rule his vast dominion, and Cleopatra, in time, followed him there for a while, a foreign queen lodged in a villa outside Rome, watched with suspicion and fascination by the Roman crowds. And then, one spring day, in the very heart of Rome, Julius Caesar was killed, struck down by a circle of his own senators, men who feared he meant to make himself a king. He fell beneath their knives on the floor of the Senate house, and with him fell all the certainty that Cleopatra had so carefully built. She was, once more, a queen alone, with a small son, a distant throne, and a world suddenly thrown into darkness and disorder. Quietly, she gathered herself and left the grieving, dangerous city and sailed home to Egypt to wait and to watch, and to see which way the great tide of Rome would turn next. With Caesar dead, the Roman world tore itself in two again, as it seemed always fated to do. His murderers on one side, his loyal followers on the other, and everywhere ambition and armies and the long grinding settling of scores. When at last the dust began to clear, the vast Roman dominion was divided roughly between two powerful men. One was Caesar's young grandnephew and heir, a cold and careful youth named Octavian, who held the West and Rome itself. The other, who took the rich and ancient East, was a soldier named Mark Antony. It is Antony who now walks into our story and stays. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of the careful Octavian. Antony was a big, warm, open-handed man, a famous general beloved by his soldiers, generous and brave and fond of pleasure, quick to laugh and quick to trust, a man who lived largely and loved largely, and did not always look before he leapt. And now, holding the eastern half of the Roman world, he needed Egypt. He needed its grain, and its gold, and its queen. So he summoned her. He sent word for Cleopatra to come and meet him in a city to the east, to answer for herself and to renew Egypt's friendship with Rome. And Cleopatra, who understood a great entrance as well as she understood a great argument, did not come humbly. She came up the river to meet him on a barge that the old writers could scarcely find words for. A ship with a gilded stern and sails of purple, its oars dipping in silver sweet perfumes drifting from it across the water, and the queen herself reclined beneath a golden canopy, dressed as a goddess while music played. The whole city, they say, poured down to the riverbanks to see her pass, until Antony was left sitting quite alone in the marketplace, his audience gone, everyone having run to glimpse the Queen of Egypt arriving like something out of a dream. You can almost hear him laughing at it, this large, good-humored man, delighted and outmatched. She had made him come to her. And so began the long partnership of Antony and Cleopatra. A bond of the heart, yes, for they were by every account devoted to one another, but a bond of hard politics too, which is the part the old legends so often forget. Each of them needed the other. He needed the wealth of Egypt to fund his wars and his ambitions. She needed the protection of a powerful Roman to keep her throne and her country and her children safe from Rome's endless hunger. It was love, perhaps. It was certainly strategy. In the best of alliances, my friend, the two are hard to tell apart. Antony came to Alexandria, and there, for a time, they were happy as two such people in such a world could ever be. He lived in her city and adopted something of her splendor. They kept a glittering court together and gathered scholars and artists and clever companions around them and spent their evenings, the stories say, in feasting and wit and games and long talk. They even formed a little society among their friends, half in jest, whose name meant something like those who will live inimitably, those who would live a life no one could imitate. They wanted, it seems, to drink deeply of a beautiful life while it lasted, and some part of them may have sensed how little of it there might be. She bore him children, twins first, a boy and a girl whom they named for the sun and the moon, Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, and later another son. And in time, Antony did a thing that thrilled his queen and enraged his fellow Romans in equal measure. In a grand ceremony in Alexandria, he gathered Cleopatra and her children before the people and parceled out to them titles and territories across the east, naming her a queen of queens and declaring her son Caesarion the true and rightful heir of the murdered Julius Caesar. To Cleopatra, it was the securing of her dynasty, a future laid out for her children. To Rome, and above all to the cold young Octavian, it looked like something else entirely. A Roman general handing away Roman lands to a foreign queen and her brood, setting up a rival power in the east, betraying Rome for the arms of Egypt. Octavian, watching from the west, understood how to use this. He was patient and calculating and skilled above all in the shaping of a story. He set about turning the Roman people against Antony, painting him not as a great Roman fallen in love, but as a man bewitched and unmanned by a scheming foreign sorceress, a Roman who had forgotten Rome. It was unfair, and it was clever, and much of the caricature of Cleopatra that has come down through all the centuries since, the seductress, the manipulator, the dangerous Eastern enchantress, was first shaped in these years quite deliberately by an enemy who needed her to seem that way. And so the trap slowly closed. Two men now held the Roman world between them, and it had become plain that it could not hold two. In the West, Octavian gathered his forces and his grievances and the loyalty of Rome. In the East, Antony and Cleopatra gathered theirs. The long friendship had curdled into rivalry, and the rivalry now hardened, quietly and unstoppably toward war. But the war itself, and the sea that decided it, and the long, soft close of the story, those we will keep for our final night together. Rest now. The court of Alexandria still glitters, the lamps are still lit, and there is time yet before the ships must sail. And so it came to war, as by now it had to. I will not fill this part of our story with clashing and clamor, for that is not why you have come to the fire tonight, and the truth of it, in any case, was less a single crash of arms than a long, slow slipping away, like a tide going out in the dark while you sleep. Let me tell it to you softly, the way it truly unfolded. Octavian, in the West, had made his choice and made it carefully. He did not declare war upon Antony, his fellow Roman. That would have looked like the old civil strife the people were so weary of. Instead, with his gift for shaping a tale, he declared war upon Cleopatra, upon the foreign queen of Egypt, so that Antony might be seen not as a Roman to be fought, but as a traitor standing on the wrong side, in thrall to her. It was a clever and a cold-hearted stroke, and it worked. The two great powers gathered their fleets and their armies and moved at last toward one another along the western coast of Greece. And there, in the year 31 before the Common Era, near a promontory called Actium, the matter was to be decided upon the water. Antony and Cleopatra had ships in great number, large and heavy vessels, and soldiers besides. But things had not gone well for them in the long, slow months of waiting. Sickness had crept through their camps. Supplies had run thin. Some of their allies and captains, sensing the way the wind was turning, had quietly slipped away to the other side. For men are ever drawn to the fortune that seems to be rising. By the time the fleets faced one another across the bay, the spirit of Antony's forces was already ebbing, though the battle had not yet begun. When at last the ships met, out upon the blue water beneath the summer sun, the fighting was hard and uncertain and choked with smoke, and it is difficult even now to say precisely how the day turned. What we know is this, that at a certain hour, with the outcome still hanging in the balance, Cleopatra's squadron of ships broke away from the battle, hoisted their sails, and fled south for the open sea and for home. And Antony, when he saw her going, broke away and followed her. Why she went, we cannot fully say. Perhaps it was a plan agreed between them to save the treasure ships and slip away to fight another day. Perhaps it was fear or the sense that the battle was already lost. The old writers, who loved to make her the villain, said she simply fled in cowardice and that Antony, besotted, abandoned his own men to chase after her. But the old writers were writing, remember, for the Rome that Octavian had built, and we need not take their unkindness as truth. What is certain is only the shape of it, that the two of them left the battle together and sailed away south, and that the fleet and the cause they left behind them soon crumbled and surrendered. The tide had gone out. It did not come back. They returned to Egypt, to Alexandria, to the palace by the sea, and there they waited, through the long months that followed, while Octavian settled his affairs and gathered himself and came, at last and unhurried, toward them. There was little left to be done. Their allies were gone. Their forces had melted away. The most powerful man in the world was on his way, and both of them, I think, knew how the story must end. Antony went first. When Octavian's forces reached the city and the last resistance failed, Antony, believing in his grief that Cleopatra was already dead, for a false word had reached him that she had died, took his own life in the old soldier's way by his own sword. But the word had been false, and she was living still, and they brought him to her, wounded, and there in her arms, the stories tell us, he died. Two people who had lived so largely come down at the last to a single quiet room. And Cleopatra remained, the last of them, the last pharaoh, a queen without an army in a city that was no longer hers. Octavian held her now, and he wanted her alive, for it was his plan to carry her back to Rome in chains, to parade her through the streets as a trophy of his triumph. The conquered foreign queen led captive behind his chariot for the crowds to jeer. She would not have it. Whatever else the world had taken from her, it would not take that. And so, in the quiet of the palace, with her most faithful servants beside her, she made her own ending, on her own terms, in a manner of her own choosing. The most famous of the old tales says it was the bite of a small serpent, an asp, smuggled to her hidden in a basket of figs, though in truth we do not know for certain how it was done, and perhaps it is gentler that we do not. When Octavian's men came at last to seize her, they were too late. They found her already gone, dressed in her royal robes, laid out in the fullness of her queenship, her faithful women dying beside her. She was 39 years old, and with her passing, 300 years of her family's rule came to an end, and 3,000 years of the pharaohs of Egypt, that long, long line stretching back into the deepest mist of human memory, came quietly to its close. She was the last. There would be no more. Egypt, after her, became a province of Rome. The old kingdom by the Nile, so ancient that it had been ancient even to the ancients, that had raised its pyramids 2,500 years before Cleopatra was ever born. This Egypt was folded now into the great machine of Rome, its harvests of golden grain shipped off across the sea to feed the Roman crowds, its throne empty forever. Octavian, who had wanted her humbled, went home and became, in time, the first emperor of Rome, and took a new and grander name, Augustus, by which the ages would remember him. The world he made would last for centuries, and Cleopatra's children were scattered by the wind of it. Her son Caesarion, the boy who carried Caesar's blood, was too dangerous to be allowed to live, and did not. But her 3 children by Antony were spared, and taken to Rome, and raised remarkably in the household of Antony's own Roman wife, a woman of great dignity who took them in as her own. Of them, her daughter Cleopatra Selene lived on to a gentle old age as a queen, far away in North Africa, and through her the blood of the last pharaoh flowed quietly onward into other royal lines long after the throne of Egypt was dust. But the woman herself, the woman herself was handed over now to the storytellers, and they were not always kind to her. For it was Rome that wrote her story first, and Rome had every reason to remember her as a danger and a temptress, the foreign enchantress who had nearly led 2 great Romans astray. And so the caricature was born, and it proved wonderfully durable, passing down the long centuries from tella to tella, from the Roman poets to the players of later ages, to the painted queens of 1,000 pictures. Always the seductress, always the schemer, always defined by the men she was near, as though she had been nothing more than a beautiful snare set beside the Nile. But you and I, my friend, have sat here together through the whole of her life, from the palace window to the quiet room at the end, and we know better now. We have seen the clever child who learned the tongues of many nations, the first of all her Greek line to trouble herself to speak with her own people in their own words. We have seen the exiled young woman who raised an army rather than vanish. We have seen the queen carried into her own palace wrapped in a bundle of cloth, staking her life upon her courage and her wit. We have seen a ruler who held her ancient failing kingdom together by every art and alliance she could command, against the greatest power the world had yet produced, and who held it against all the odds for more than 20 years. Not a caricature at all, a scholar, a stateswoman, a queen who fought to her very last breath for the country that was hers. That is who she truly was. And that is who I should like you to remember as the fire settles now and the story comes to its rest. There now, the tale is told, and the ships have all come home, and the harbor of Alexandria lies quiet under the stars, just as it does to this very day. It is a strange and gentle thing, is it not, to think how a life so full of storm, of wars and voyages, of thrones won and lost, of love and grief and great decisions made in the dark, should come down to us at last as a story, soft enough to send a dear friend off to sleep. But that is what time does in the end to all our storms. It smooths them, it quiets them, it turns the sharpest of days into something worn and warm and kind, like a stone rolled smooth by the sea, like the pages of a very old and well-loved book. She has been gone now for 2,000 years, the last Pharaoh of Egypt. The lighthouse that lit her harbor has long since fallen. The great library has scattered on the wind. And yet here we are, you and I, in a little pool of candlelight, still speaking her name gently, still remembering the clever girl who stood at her window and watched the ships. Nothing that is truly loved is ever wholly lost. It only waits quietly in the pages for someone to open the book again. And now it is time for you to rest, if you have not drifted off already, somewhere back among the purple sails and the silver oars. Let the fire burn low. Let the old books sleep upon their shelves. Let every care of your day grow soft and far away, like a shore seen from a boat that is carrying you gently out to sea. Sleep now, my dear friend. You are safe, and you are warm, and all is well. I will be here by the fire whenever you should wish to hear another story. Good night. Good night.